Hello everyone, it's Club of Thailand. We're really delighted to have you here today. For the who's joining us online, workers in ASEAN. Just a little bit of housekeeping for those in the room with us today. There's bathrooms are out towards the elevators where you came in and to the right, and the emergency exit in the case of an emergency is also that way. Donors of the Triangle and ASEAN project, that's the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Global Affairs Canada. Thank you very much to the donors. Without your support, we would not be able to continue to do this work, to support domestic workers in the ASEAN region and to fill in knowledge gaps in research and favourite organisation, and I'm thrilled to be here. Of the Regional Office of Asia and Pacific for the ILO.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Here's your phone so that it is in this room, but also those joining us online. Like Joanna, I also like to thank our donors for this important work, the Government of Australia and the Government of Canada for their very generous support over the years. I also would like to thanks and pay tribute to domestic workers who have been part of this study. They have come forward to share insights into their life stories, which give our research team a very good sure we'll hear more about the substance of the report later today. Let me just spend the globe. Tens of millions of domestic workers are at work every day to look after our homes and families. The care they provide inside our home is not just vital. It forms the very foundation of our society. Their work remains unrelenting against a critical sector of our world of work, motivated us at the ILO to investigate what we consider the sophisticated skills, the profiles of the skills of migrant domestic workers in the Asia-Pacific region. And also on the skills, we also found that migrant domestic workers are still experiencing forced labor at alarming rates. You'll hear more about these dimensions. Also, let me also mention that in the broad context that why we at the ILO focus on domestic work sector. This is significant because globally there are 75 million domestic workers in the world over the age of 15. Asia Pacific employs the world in total in this region. So the region remains the world's largest employer of domestic workers. There are also men domestic workers, accounting for nearly half of the total number of men domestic workers across the world. As per the ILO Domestic Workers Convention number 189, it is very clear. The convention defines as domestic work for households, often as gardeners, that includes those providing household management. It was this range of tasks within domestic work that we wanted to explore further, but also reveal a situation where, despite the skills required and the essential nature of the work, major destinations for migrants, 4% of domestic workers in our region, 1% of domestic workers remain fully excluded normal working hours. And only to the same extent, it made numerous commitments to improve to assist the Convention, the Fundamental and Harassment Convention 2000 against this practice. Other stakeholders who seek to improve conditions for. Allow me here to briefly, in discussion with world leaders, head of government, would aim to balance environment protection and decent work. Because the foundation workers.
Thanks, Kim Pin, for your comments and for highlighting the important work of DIM. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rebecca Napier-Moore. She's a technical officer in the report. Rebecca, stage is yours.
Thank you, Joanna, and hi, everyone. Specialist and quality. Many thanks is a well-informed study. So I want to start out giving you 3 takeaway points today. I'd like to ask everyone in this room if you could raise your hand if you were surprised by any of these. Did any of these surprise you? You didn't know or expect them? Or you expected all of them, maybe? Great. 1, 2. Okay. Over to the next slide. Just a quick run through who we interviewed and where. We did quantitative surveys with over 600 employers and 1,200 women migrant domestic workers. And the migrant domestic workers were interviewed in Malaysia. We interviewed Cambodians, Filipinas, and Indonesians. In Singapore, we interviewed Filipinas, Indonesians. Also did qualitative, in-depth interviews, 38 of them, with a variety of actors. Okay, next slide. We're going to look at what forced labor is and what it looks like in this sector. Next slide. Some of you might remember Venn diagrams from math class. This is a diagram where there's 2 categories, and where they overlap is the middle of the Venn diagram. And this is how we measure forced labor at the ILO. An individual is of penalty. So involuntariness and a penalty, then that corresponds. So just to explain a little bit of what those categories are, the first on involuntariness includes situations where a person is working for no or very little wage. Very poor circumstances that may give rise to involuntary work. As the technique studied, the circle could answer that one of these things was true in their situation, an indication of involuntariness. 79% in Malaysia, 90% in Singapore, and 76% in Thailand. The second set of questions, which the smaller circles represent, is related to penalty, in other words, people being locked in a house, for instance, withholding wages, withholding identity documents or phones, constant surveillance, so a CCTV camera, for instance, and threats of dismissal or deportation. So the percentages of these were for Malaysia 41%, Singapore 7%, and Thailand 5%. Where a person answered both is the overlap, is 29%. We also disaggregated this data by countries of origin, where people came from. If you look at the red color for Malaysia, you'll see that not only is every nationality of migrant domestic worker indicated at above 25% in forced labor, but also that those from Cambodia have horrible odds. Over half reported conditions. Next slide, please. We also looked at risk factors for forced labor. And to understand this, more likely to be in a situation of forced labor if they had an irregular work status. In Thailand, a major risk factor was in forced labor if they had high migration costs. In Singapore, people were 47.7 times more likely to be in forced labor if they had salary deductions. And I want to focus here on this last point, as the forced labor number from Malaysia and Cambodia took our attention on the last 2 slides. So moving here about salary deductions. And the employers and recruitment fees and costs. However, of that 95% that said they did that, 90% said they told us that they pass costs on to the worker through deductions. When we asked them what some of these costs were, 40% said documentation costs, 35% said recruitment fees, 25% travel, 24%. To emphasize that Singaporean employers are prohibited by the Ministry of Manpower to ask the worker to pay for the security bond. And further, the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act says that the salary deductions are not allowed for the work pass, security bond, medical insurance and exams, training, or repatriation travel. Okay, next slide. What working conditions are we talking about? There's a lot in the report, and I just want to focus now on two things. Way of measuring hours, taking the 48 hours per week. And the chart on the left suggests that the majority in all countries are. And just to mention and give you a kind of baseline, the labor laws in each of these countries set a maximum number of hours, but domestic workers are exempted. So in Malaysia, the labor law for other sectors sets the maximum at 48. In Singapore, at 44, and Thailand at 48. However, and the next slide will show you this data, that on average, domestic workers in the region are working between on-call or standby hours. And this is very relevant for domestic workers who are living in. So they live in the same house as their employee. And if the person they're caring for wakes up in the middle of the night, it's their job to also wake up in the middle of the night and be on call and work. So some of these figures, it can be in the night. In Singapore, 95% said yes, they have to be on call. However, fewer people in Singapore have to be on call in their sleeping hours. So that's good. And Thailand had the lowest level of people saying they had to be on call, 41%. Okay, next slide on wages in the report. And I just want to give you one message about wages. And that is from the bottom row of this chart, the standard week that other workers have. Then what we found is not one respondent of our study, 1,201 people, not one, received or a proxy for it with the instance of Singapore, which I can explain later if anyone's interested. And this correlates as entitled to a minimum wage. Okay, next slide. I want to start with this great quote from a representative from the Thai government who exactly pinned down what the problem is. And this, and undignified, treated as, quote, workers. We wanted to survey. A survey has been done to audit against for an elementary occupation, for medium skill, and for high skilled work. Okay, next slide, please. 62% on average in the region are doing direct, anyone taking care of children, anyone taking care of elderly level looks like. It's